Hello, and welcome to a Season 1 episode of Beyond Teaching, a new series featured on the PsychSessions network. This series is hosted by Susan Nolan from Seton Hall University, Adelinka Akinseler-Smith from City College of New York, City University of New York, Asani Sewell from Pacific University, and yours truly, Eric Landrum from Boise State University. Through informal discussions and email exchanges, what we discovered and agreed upon is that to be a successful academic or professional, it takes more than teaching, research, or clinical skills. That is, today's psychology professionals were not taught everything they need to know in graduate school. How do you find a mentor in your career path? And what do you do if that mentoring relationship turns sour? What are the strategies for dealing with Zoom fatigue, both for you and your students? How do you learn to say no, whether that is for a job offer, a student's letter of recommendation request, or a potential committee assignment? How do you choose what journal to submit your work to, and how do you deal with cranky reviewers? These topics and more are discussed in the Season 1 episodes that are now being released spring and summer of 2021. In future seasons, we'll be inviting guest experts to join us, and we have a host of topics to discuss regarding areas of our jobs that no one ever prepared us for. Now, I don't mean that to sound cranky or anything, but there really is a lot that no one ever told us, right? And so that's what this podcast is all about, taking us beyond teaching. So what do you want to talk about first?
We don't have to even, those are just suggestions. We don't even have to do them, but
anything on your mind? Any hot topic?
I like the first one you were just saying about how to choose. What was it about how to choose?
There's one about how to choose and get involved in professional organizations. And there's one that's how to choose which committees to join.
Those are linked, I think, in a way.
Yeah. I think they're different though, because committees is within your institution, whether or not you're working at a university or an academic medical center or whatever. And there's a different kind of politics that you're playing internally. And finding a professional organization, I think, is finding like your home and your network and it's less directly relevant, for example, to getting tenure. It can be very helpful, but
sometimes you need to be on committees for tenure, depending on where you are.
That's the internal. Like I see them as two different discussions. The internal, how do you figure out what committees to be on at the institution where you work? And the other is, how do you see yourself as part of the larger discipline?
Yeah, I think they sound like they're different, but I think how you make choices and how you decide, I think that mechanism, at least for me, is very similar. But let's get into it and talk about it, shall we?
How to figure out which committees to get involved in, sort of the balance of, and we can get into this whole issue that women, and particularly BIPOC women and BIPOC people, are like, oh, we need a fill in the blank on this committee kind of stuff too, and the protecting yourself as well. So all of these issues I think are relevant.
That and the ability to say no, and when we get there, obviously, sadly, you have to define BIPOC for many of our listeners.
True.
And I would throw in, depending on where you are in the hierarchy, because if you are an assistant coming in and feeling the pressure for tenure, you may be pulled in other ways. And then if you're in a department where you have supportive allies who look out for you, they might say, because that was my experience, where I don't want to say this, but I have been blessed by the ability to fly under the radar. So it was actually my chair and others saying, you know what, why don't you do this committee? Because it doesn't require a lot except for you to do blah, blah, blah. So I knock on wood, I don't know, thank the higher powers, was never in a position where I got pulled and yanked into doing a zillion and one committees. I was able to fly under the radar and just pick, okay, I'll do this one and I'll do that one. And please leave me alone and let me be.
So welcome to another episode of Beyond Teaching. And I'm going to introduce myself and let my colleagues introduce themselves. I'm Eric Landrum.
I'm Yinka Akinseler-Smith.
And I'm Susan Nolan.
And we're here today. We have been debating. We've been doing the virtual arm wrestling before we turned on the microphones and hit the record button. And colleagues, I think we settled on how to select what committees to serve on within your institution. Did I get that close to being correct?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes,
All right.
And part of our debate, Eric, was the internal versus external. And in our next episode of Beyond Teaching, we're going to look at the external, the professional organizations, but separating out the internal, whether or not you work at an academic institution or a medical setting, or how do you figure out where to get involved there?
And some of us think the processes are parallel while others don't. And we won't reveal that yet. We'll make you listen to the next episode to know where those similarities and differences lie.
And we've got perspectives here. Eric and I are just at academic institutions, whereas Yinka has her foot in more than one type of institutions. I know committees differ depending on whether or not you're in an academic institution or a clinical setting, and even expectations for what you'll do.
Well, and I like what Susan just said there. So we've got two people here who are one-trick ponies, and then we've got a super talented person who can navigate multiple worlds and multiple venues. And so we're super glad that Yinka has joined us.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped out.
Oh, that's
Technological
okay.
problems. Sorry.
It's really unfortunate when you miss the compliments. But when we play it back, I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay.
So I guess maybe we can start going back to the beginning, because one of the things that Yinka said to us before we started this podcast today was this idea that your decisions vary depending on what stage of your career you're in. So maybe we can talk about when you're early in your career and that there's some kind of promotion or tenure hanging on what you do in terms of your service. So what do we think about things to consider when you start a new position?
Right. So when you're early in your career, especially in academia, and there's this whole notion of the three-legged stool, there's the research, the teaching, and committee service. And often when you come up for tenure, they want to see that you have equally distributed yourselves among the three, although we really do know that it's more the publications, depending on where you are, that really counts. Right. But serving on committees takes time and energy.
I would also say that if they're looking for a reason not to give you tenure, poor service can be their out. So you don't want to give anybody that out. And also, if anybody is listening who is in grad school and isn't really unsure of what we even mean by service, I know that I didn't initially. It sounded like, oh, you volunteer somewhere. But really, these are the committees that make the organization run, whether or not they're committees to approve new courses or hiring committees, or something as seemingly boring as one that I'm on right now, a bylaws committee, which actually is quite interesting. They're the kinds of committees that faculty and other people have input on that make the university run.
And I would actually add, Susan, to expand that a little bit, that there's also committee work within the community. So as I was saying, both to Eric and Susan earlier, in a way, I was a little protected from the grind of a lot of committee service on campus. I was doing a lot of work within the community, within the larger community. So that wound up actually, for me, when I look back on it now, counting to my community service, because the college, your educational setting wants to look good in the larger community. They want to see us also contributing not just to our organization, but to what's going on outside, so that we're playing well in the play box, if you will.
And also, you want to look at your institution's rules. At many institutions, it's some kind of a faculty guide. At my institution, they expect you to participate in committee work at the department level, at the college level, and at the university level. So we couldn't have just done community-related service per our faculty guide. So that's something you really want to look at. And also, Yinka, you mentioned you were protected. If you're lucky enough to have a department chair who protects you, you can use that person, even if they don't require you to check in before accepting a committee assignment. You can use that person and say, I'm so grateful that you asked me. This sounds like a wonderful opportunity. I can't say yes to anything without running it by my chair.
Yes.
If you're lucky enough to have a chair who will do that for you, even if they really don't require it, that is a great situation to give yourself some time to think about it, ask other people, and also get the dirt on what that committee does. Is it a hard committee? Is it political? Should you avoid it before you have tenure, and so on?
Yeah. And just to feed off what Susan is saying, networking within your department to find out what the expectations are, but also outside your department. You also, just to add to this, you don't want to be in a position where you're on a committee. How do I say this in a politically good way? That you're challenging people who will be looking at your documents when you go up for tenure. You don't want to spanner yourself. So there's a political tightrope that you also wind up walking.
I actually have an example from when I started. I was asked to be on or to run for the College of Arts and Sciences Educational Policy Committee, the famous EPC, where you vote on which courses get to run. That is a terrible place for an untenured person to be. And in retrospect, if I'd had the advice, it took me a bit to figure out mentors when I started. If I had the advice, somebody would have told me not to be on the EPC as a first year untenured professor.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great advice that you've both just offered. I think sometimes the chair is not the person that might be your mentor, but a senior faculty member in the department. Sometimes the chair isn't always the best person. Mm-hmm. I think that at Boise State, we try to protect brand new faculty members, and we actually try to give them a lower amount of service so they can concentrate on other things. Because sometimes the service component is the easier of the three-legged stool. And so sometimes you want to do the easier of the three, especially in a new job, but we need them to start doing the harder two things of the three things. Or we direct them to do a departmental service or a college service before you jump into a university level committee. So there's some things that we can steer there. Like Susan, no one steered you away from that dreaded committee that if someone had been paying attention would have told you about. I also think it's important, especially as people progress in their careers, to develop the ability to say no, which we rarely talk about in higher education. We all develop expertise over our careers, no matter what the scenario over time. We develop expertise, and academics are almost always very generous with that time and expertise and give away their services pro bono. And community members and people on campus outside of our departments figure that out, and they want that expertise for free. But at some point, we have families and loved ones and our own interests to pursue, and we need to be careful about that as well.
And sometimes you get hit up for favors, particularly if, for example, you're good at statistics and people want you to look at their statistics, and that can turn into a big time suck. And also, just to very quickly get back to the dreaded EPC, the dreaded EPC is wonderful if you have the protection of tenure. There are a lot of committees that are actually quite enjoyable to be on if you feel protected. It really varies depending on your career stage.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
We were talking a little bit about how do you choose? And so I think one of the tenets there, one of the axioms would be talk to people around you that you trust, maybe the chair, maybe more senior faculty members, but also try to choose something, if it's possible, that aligns with your own interests. So if you are interested in learning outcomes, you're an educational psychologist or cognitive psychologist, then maybe the curriculum committee isn't as bad as it might sound to others, or maybe the assessment committee is actually more interesting to you because it aligns with your interests. If you are a counseling psychologist, then maybe being on the institutional care committee or whatever it's called at your institution, if it's at all possible to choose service that aligns with your interests, try to double dip. It's not evil to do that. It's actually quite wise when it can happen.
Yeah, and that was actually, you're saying something I had planned to say, because that's my current MO. I almost never do something anymore that's not at least a double dip, if not a triple dip. And I think that's actually good for all involved. I think the committee benefits in that way. And I can think of a million examples. My colleague, Andrew Simon at Seton Hall, who's an industrial and organizational psychologist, has been very involved with our university's strategic plan, which is a perfect meshing of his expertise and what the university needs. So it can be a win-win.
Maybe without getting too personal, can you, and I'll do the same, can you each recall a committee experience institutionally or in the community that was a fantastic experience and one that was a dreaded experience? And then you can talk in great detail about the fantastic one, and then please anonymize, of course, the dreaded one. And can you recall and share some of the characteristics, traits, and qualities maybe that would define either of those experiences? And if you want to skip and not play, that's fine.
I would say that just broadly speaking about the dreaded committees, a dreaded committee is one that has in my mind, no real concrete outcome. It's just something that the university sort of needs to have. And so people are just phoning it in or not showing up. And so you don't really get to network. You're not doing something that you feel is making a difference. And it really just feels like a waste of time. And every institution has a lot of these. They just have to have them. Whereas a committee that is really fun and exciting to be on, we have a university research council, which gives internal grants to faculty members for summer research. It's incredibly rewarding to be on that committee and to see what our colleagues are doing and decide who's going to get this money. And it also becomes a way to see if there are like-minded people in different departments and maybe find a new person you want to network with. So I think looking for, what are the concrete outcomes? I also think particularly for anyone who's going up promotion, whether or not it's a junior person going up for tenure eventually, or someone with tenure eventually going up for full professor, you want to think a little bit about visibility, because you want the committee, at least some chunk of the committee, to know your name when you come up. So what are the committees? Get on at least one or two where you are going to be visible. And often the person who chairs the committee is not doing a whole lot more work than the rest of the committee. So think about a place where you might run for chair of your committee. Ask the previous chair about the amount of time. But if it's not a whole lot more work to lead it than to be on it, why not give yourself that visibility?
Yeah, I agree very much with the things that you've said. When I think about dreaded committee, it was one that sucked my time, sucked my energy, and was just one of these, okay, it's that time to go do it now. Let's do it and get it over with. And it wasn't as enjoyable. Whereas I can't remember what the name of the committee was way back when, but it was it was like a vision planning for the college. And it was people from other departments coming together, getting to know them, getting to hear about the different departments, who they were, what they represented, and the vision that they saw. That was interesting and exciting. And it felt good to be a part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not gonna pose this and then dodge it.
We're not gonna let you.
Thank you. For me, I think the negative experiences have been where people just came to it with a really bad attitude, or they were social loafers. They said they would do something, they missed their deadlines, which caused a domino effect of other people having to do extra work or more work. And I think that's been the case on committees which had really tight deadlines, or they were doing important work. Like, for example, if they were giving out student scholarships and there was a deadline for that's when committees have been icky in the past. And then I have a recollection of, I think it was a university-wide orientation committee, and I'm going to call it 20 years ago. And something on that committee just clicked. The work was hard. We were planning, I think we were implementing a brand new orientation program for the university. There's probably 12 people on this committee from all walks of the university. I got to know people from different units of the university I'd never met. By that time, I was probably an associate professor, so I had tenure. And the people just got along really well. We really, I'm going to use this word carefully, but we came to love one another. We really adored one another. After the committee's work was over, we had committee reunions. We would meet at someone's house a year later, and then another year later for a couple of years. And then people started to retire or they started to move away. But it was just this lovely, rare bonding of people who loved working together, loved working on a singular project, and then didn't want to stop meeting together.
Yep. I was on one like that for an international committee at Seton Hall, and we continued to meet long after. And I also, this is going to sound at first like a really dumb thing to say, but let me explain. I think it's sometimes at the university level, particularly, there are committees that feed you, that give you a lunch as part of your committee work. Aim for those committees. And this is why it's going to sound dumb, because it's not why you think. The reason is if you're showing up a half an hour early for the lunch, that's when you socialize. So the committees that give you food, it forces you almost to socialize. And those committees, I ended up knowing my colleagues much, much better than a committee where you just all swoop in, you meet and you leave. So look for the committees that feed you, because that's going to help you network. And you get free food too, which is fine. It's great, but that's not the reason.
The thing that I would throw in there, the extra bonus that sometimes can come out of this is a potential collaborator.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a research project, whether it's a presentation, you just never know where you're going to pick up someone whose interests dovetail with yours.
So as we draw to a close on this, I want to ask you both about what type of advice would you have for a faculty member anywhere in their career? They find themselves on a university committee, a community board member, and they're having a negative experience. How do they either extract themselves from that, make the best of it? They realize it's no longer in sync with what's best for them, what's best for their career. Can they resign from that without damage to their career? What advice would you give them in proceeding in that situation?
I think if they're early on, it depends on how they extract themselves. If you just stop going, then it looks, but if you can gently find some sort of good excuse, if you're able to wait it out till the end of the semester, for example, and able to come up with some good reason that's not complaining, that might be one way to do it.
I would say if you're an untenured person, if it's a toxic situation and it's really harmful, I would say look for an out like Yinka was describing. I think if it's just unpleasant and you're untenured, I do think you should suck it up and get through that term, unfortunately. If you're tenured, I think you've got more flexibility. But yeah, I would recommend that. But that's why I go back to this. Whether it's your chair or another person, never say yes immediately. Say, I need to ask my mentor who's been looking at my overarching career. I need to ask my chair. That's ideal because everyone would even believe that you must ask your chair, because that's not true in my department, but people can believe that. And do this research before you say yes, so you can try to avoid those committees.
Yeah.
I think also too, that if you find yourself in a place where you have to step away from a committee, as long as you're not putting a colleague into the same toxic situation, you might try to find a replacement. So maybe if you feel like you're under threat as an untenured faculty member, could you find a tenured member of your department, having fully informed her or him of what's going on? Could they step in? Therefore, you're not leaving the committee hanging, but you're not putting someone who is at the same risk. You know what I'm saying? So maybe the committee can still operate, the committee can still have departmental representation, but the person on it is a little bit more insulated from damage compared to an untenured member who's just getting berated or abused verbally or workload wise or whatever.
And just one last thing before we end that I think is really important to mention is that women and people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC people are much more likely to be pulled into more committees than are men and white people, and often for token representation. And so I think it's very important that if you're in these groups, that you make sure you're working with a mentor, somebody who will help you protect yourself and know what's being asked of you is too much. And I also think it's important that those of us who are senior and or able to be allies can watch out for our particularly junior colleagues who might be being maybe taken advantage of in unconscious ways, but taken advantage of nonetheless.
Right. And I think it really goes to the point of having someone in your corner, a good mentor who you can turn to bounce ideas, bounce questions like this off of. It's so key to having someone in your corner who you can trust.
Yeah, and Susan, I won't disagree at all with the notion of tokenism, but I also think at times at institutions, it might be that I really do want the opinion of my Hispanic female colleague, and it's not tokenism. I really do want her opinion, but 42 other committees on campus also want her opinion. And it's not tokenism. It's we need more people who look like our students on our campus in Idaho.
Absolutely.
And we don't have enough
Yeah.
people representing the broad spectrum. And what Yinka just said, we have to be respectful, not overuse that expertise that we want to tap into, because we just have to be respectful of that. So I agree. Sometimes it is tokenism, but sometimes it's just going back to the same person over and over again because we
Yes.
really value their opinions. We gotta let them do their regular job and not do the jobs of everybody else on campus and sharing their expertise.
Great.
All right. Thanks for joining us for another episode.
Thank you.